My family called me a failure, while I secretly paid their mortgage for 5 years, so I sold their house. The day they tried to kick me out. Before we dive into today's story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading every single one. And if you enjoy real-life stories filled with betrayal, family pressure, and shocking twists, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Imagine being called a failure by the very people you're secretly sacrificing everything for. Here's how it all unfolded. In my family, I was the backup plan. My brother Leo was the golden child, a failed entrepreneur who blew through my parents' retirement fund on crypto startups that never started. I was the disappointment because I moved to the city and forgot my roots. For 5 years, I've been secretly wire transferring $3,000 a month to keep my parents from losing their home, pretending the money was a government grant. But when Leo decided he wanted to move back home and needed my office to be his new podcast studio, my parents didn't hesitate. They told me I had 48 hours to pack my bags. They thought they were kicking out a loser. They didn't realize they were evicting their own landlord. The dinner was a celebration for Leo's latest failure. Pivot. My mom was doting on him while my dad glared at me. Leo needs the space, Sarah. He's going to be the next big thing. You're just a mid-level manager. You can find a studio apartment. Leo smirked, leaning back in his chair. Don't be bitter, sis. Some people are born to lead, and some are born to follow. Maybe if you'd worked harder, Dad wouldn't have had to win that government grant to keep the lights on. I felt the cold weight of the deed in my bag. I hadn't just been sending money. 6 months ago, when the bank finally moved to foreclose, I didn't just pay the arrears. I bought the entire mortgage from the bank. The next morning, Leo started throwing my boxes into the hallway. Clock's ticking, Sarah. I've got a 4K camera set up arriving at noon. I walked into the kitchen where my parents were drinking coffee, looking smug. I didn't yell. I just placed a single manila envelope on the table. What's this? Your moving out notice? Dad laughed. Actually, it's yours, I said. Dad, remember that government grant that's been paying the mortgage since 2021? There is no grant. That was my salary. And when you stopped paying the property taxes last year because you bought Leo a new SUV, the bank didn't just forgive you, they sold the debt. Leo walked in holding one of my lamps. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I am the sole owner of 124 Maple Street, I said, pointing to the deed. I bought the house to keep you from being homeless, but since you've decided this is a studio for Leo's non-existent career, I've decided to liquidate my assets. My mom's face went white. You can't sell your parents' house. That's illegal. It's perfectly legal when I'm the one on the title, I replied. And since I already have a cash offer from a developer who wants to turn this lot into a duplex, I've already signed the papers. The closing is in 3 days. The golden child suddenly wasn't so golden. When my parents turned to Leo and asked him to use his business connections to save them, he admitted he didn't have a cent. He'd spent the SUV money on designer clothes and memberships to clubs he couldn't afford. I watched as they realized they had sacrificed their only stable child for a professional con artist. 3 days later, the moving truck arrived, but it wasn't for me. I'd already moved my things into a luxury high-rise downtown. I stood on the sidewalk as the sold sign was hammered into the lawn. Where are we supposed to go? My mom sobbed, clutching a picture of Leo. Leo's a leader, right? I said, looking at my brother, who was trying to fit his podcast equipment into a rusted sedan. I'm sure he has a pivot for this. Maybe he can find you a studio somewhere. I walked away with a $200,000 profit from the sale. I didn't give them a dime. I spent 5 years being the invisible safety net, and all it got me was an eviction notice. My parents and Leo are currently living in a 2-bedroom rental that Leo has to pay for. Last I heard, he's working 3 jobs and doesn't have time to record a single episode. They called me a failure for years, but in the end, I was the only one who knew the value of a solid foundation. If you want to treat your family like a bank, don't be surprised when the bank closes your account. The next morning was chaos. I woke up to the sound of Leo dragging my desk across the hardwood floor. He was already taping acoustic foam to the walls of my bedroom. Hope you're packed, Sarah. The Leo King podcast waits for no one. You can leave the lamp, though. It fits the vibe. I walked into the kitchen. My parents were sitting there looking remarkably peaceful for people who were about to throw their daughter onto the street. My mom was busy making Leo's favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with extra syrup. Dad, I said, leaning against the counter, I need you to look at something before I go. My dad didn't even look up from his newspaper. If it's a bill for your moving van, don't bother. You're an adult, Sarah. Time to handle your own business like Leo does. It's not a bill, I said, sliding a thick manila envelope onto the table, right on top of his sports section. It's a record of every government grant payment made to this house since 2021. My dad frowned, opening the envelope. His eyes scanned the bank statements. What is this? These aren't from the state. These are wire transfers from a private account. From my account, Dad. Every single month for 5 years, $180,000 in total. I didn't want you to feel the shame of failing, so I let you believe the grant story, but I didn't stop at the mortgage. Leo walked in, a smug grin on his face. What's she whining about now? Is she still upset about the room? Leo, sit down, I said, my voice as cold as ice. I'm talking about the property taxes you guys forgot to pay last year, the ones you ignored so you could buy Leo that SUV. The bank didn't forgive that debt, Dad. They foreclosed, and I didn't just pay it off. I bought the deed. The kitchen went dead silent. The only sound was the sizzle of Leo's pancakes burning on the stove. You bought the house? My mom whispered, her spatula trembling. I am the sole owner of 124 Maple Street, I said, pulling out the notarized deed. Which means technically Leo isn't moving into his new studio. He's trespassing on my private property. And since you both told me that I'm a failure who doesn't understand family values, I've decided to take your advice. I'm putting my business interests first. Leo's face turned a pathetic shade of white. You can't do that. We're family. We were family when I was paying your electricity bills, Leo, I replied. Now? Now we're just a landlord and some very problematic tenants. And I've already signed the sales agreement with the developer. The house gets bulldozed in 30 days. I suggest you start looking for a studio that fits your actual budget, which I assume is zero. The next 72 hours were a masterclass in panic. My parents spent them begging Leo to dip into his investments to buy the house back from me. It was the first time they actually looked at his bank accounts. There were no investments, no crypto startups. Just a $14,000 balance on a credit card my mom had co-signed and a pile of luxury clothing receipts. The golden child wasn't just broke, he was a black hole of debt. I stood in the living room as the moving crew I hired began packing the few things I actually cared about. My mom was sitting on the stairs, surrounded by boxes, weeping. Sarah, please, she sobbed. We're your parents. You're really going to let them tear down the house where you grew up. I'm letting them tear down the house I've been a slave to for 5 years, I said. This isn't a home, Mom. It's a museum dedicated to a son who doesn't care about you. If I keep this house, I'm just keeping the cycle alive. It's time you all learned what things actually cost. Leo tried one last alpha move. He stood on the lawn as the developer's car pulled up, trying to block the driveway. You're a monster, Sarah. You're destroying our legacy. Legacy? I laughed, handing him a flyer for a local apartment complex. This is the legacy of your SUV and your fake podcast. I'm walking away with a $250,000 check from this sale. That's my success fee for 5 years of being your ATM. You're walking away with a used car and a very loud microphone. The developer handed me the final closing documents. I signed them on the hood of my car, handed over the keys, and didn't look back. I watched through the rearview mirror as my parents loaded their suitcases into Leo's back seat. For the first time in their lives, they were looking at Leo not with pride, but with the terrifying realization that they were now dependent on a man who couldn't even pay his own phone bill. I moved into a penthouse 3 blocks from my office. It's quiet, it's clean, and the only person I'm responsible for is myself. My parents are currently living in a cramped 2-bedroom rental on the edge of town. Leo had to get a job at a warehouse to cover the rent, his first real job in a decade. He hasn't recorded a single podcast episode since. They call me every week crying about family loyalty, but I don't answer. I learned that loyalty is a two-way street, and mine was a dead end. If you want to treat your daughter like a safety net, don't be surprised when she decides to become a kite instead.